Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I just appreciate you watching. That's the wrong frame for this class. Let's get the right one. That's the wrong one. There we go. Web design. That's the class. So as we get started today, just a couple of announcements really quickly here. Next week, instead of a live class, I will have a bit of a different video for you all. I have a recording of an interview that was done with a content design expert that I think is some really good information. So in lieu of a live class next week, I will be posting that instead. So there will be no live session next week. This is a 3-week module, which is a little bit different for this class. What I tried to do for this class is I tried to work in Thanksgiving for you all. So you could kind of work things out and take that week off if you wanted to for this class at least. To where you could kind of get ahead and work around and do some different things. So you could take the Thanksgiving holiday week and work with that in a little different way. So there is that. If you, but you know, that's up to you all in terms of how you want to do that. But the big thing out of all of that is that, you know, no live stream next week, right? Just the pre-recorded video. But we're talking about content versus design this week, and the idea of content and design. And I think these are some pretty big concepts for us to discuss here. You know, when we're talking about content and design, and kind of how the two relate to one another, because we really haven't talked much about content as we've progressed this week or this semester. Right? We've talked a lot about design, and we've talked a lot about flows, and we've talked a lot about, you know, how we can take and make a path and that, you know, drive someone through a website. But we've not really talked a whole lot about the content of a website. And to some degree, that's been on purpose. Right? Because a lot of the good basic design stuff that we do is universal, right? Like the type of content or whatever you're creating doesn't really matter as far as all of that goes. But it's time to talk about content now. So as we're talking about content, I think the very first thing that we need to talk about as we're discussing content is just defining content. Just what is content? And similarly with a lot of other things that we've kind of been dealing with over the course of the semester, as we're talking about what content is, we're really left with a definition that can kind of branch off into multiple directions. So when we ask ourselves the question, what is content? One of the first questions that we branch off of from there is, well, what's the site about? What is the site about that we are creating here? And that forms the foundation of the content. Just what is it about? And if you look at every single site on the internet, every single site can be boiled down into, its syrup, if you will, like its essence of just what exactly that site is about. Even if it's just a store like Amazon or a search engine like Google, right? Like, there is something that all of these sites are about, whether it is abstract or whether it is straightforward. And so one of the first things that I asked you all to do was to define your problem. So we asked ourselves kind of what the problem is that we're solving. And in asking ourselves what the problem is that we're solving, we kind of figured out, well, what our site is going to be about. The core of what our site is about. So, content at its essence then becomes directly related to the problem that you're solving. Right? So when we're thinking about our design process and we're thinking about, the things that we've done throughout the semester that get us to this point, the things that we've done way back in September, right? As we were kind of creating a site, we defined the problem. And the problem led us to, doing some surveying, asking some more questions, trying to figure out, what people need in that area. And then from there, we start building a representation of the solution of the problem. So really, like, when it comes to, for example, your final project for this semester, which is, kind of the design process that we've been working on, the reason why we talk about content at this point is that really, like, you're developing your content at this stage of the process. Right? You defined your problem way back in September. You started surveying and asking people questions, and you started kind of coming up with concepts and ideas, and now you're putting into words or pictures or a combination thereof, multimedia situations, the representation of the solution of your problem. Or a representation of what your site is about. Which may or may not be, and I should kind of correct myself there, that it may or may not be the entire solution to your problem. Right, in terms of in terms of what the content is that you display, because, we've talked about how we display the content being as important, if not in many cases more so important, than what the exact content is. And so oftentimes when we think about content, we think about it in these sort of ideals. We think about it as this representational format. But then in thinking about it like that, I think we miss the big picture. Right? Because there's something about content that is important for us to realize. And especially content on a website. And that is that content on a website is, for all intents and purposes, a living entity. Content on a website is a living entity. Right, we've been working with websites for a while now, right? Many of you, all of you have been working with websites for a while. And one of the things that we've learned about websites is that if we make a mistake, we can go back and change it fairly easily, right? Like, it doesn't really cost us anything to go back onto a website and fix a typo, to reword a paragraph, to change a few sentences, to replace a picture, right? These things aren't cost factors for us. They're just things that we do. We can go on and we can do them for free. So I don't want you all to get caught up in the idea of content being the exact words that is on our website. Even though I think that's an easy concept for us to get caught up in. Right? Is the idea of content being the words that are on our website. But we're talking more about ideas, concepts. Solutions to problems, what things are about, how we choose to represent the solutions to our problems, how we choose to represent the things that we are saying. Because when we think about things in terms of how content is represented on the web, we can change it at any time. Print, on the other hand, if we think about print and thinking about content for print, we do have to be a little more strict when it comes to content for print. Right? Because when you design a piece that is to be printed and you print 1,000 copies, and then you see the finished printed work, and you say, hey, I could have worded that better, or there's a typo there, or I misspelled that, or something's wrong here. Then what you've done is you've invalidated an entire print run, and you've lost money for these items that were printed. And that is, of course, less than ideal. So when I use the term as, the website content is living, whereas, print content might be dead, right? Like, that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Right? My website content, I can go back in there, I can change relatively easily. So I don't necessarily have to think about it in such strict terms. Because if I need to make changes, I can make changes on the fly, I can make changes quickly. And I can make changes for free. For example, we've talked about A/B testing at an earlier point in this semester. If I determine through some A/B testing that maybe a certain phrase or a certain picture or a certain whatever doesn't test well or doesn't communicate my message as well, then I can easily go in and replace it. And so really, as we're talking about this, it brings up the importance of being able to separate the idea of content from the idea of design. Right? So one of the things that we say is that content and design are separate, but design is content dependent. So design is content dependent. So what does that mean, that design is content dependent? We kind of hinted at some of the ideas of design being content dependent a couple weeks ago, right? When we were talking about the typography. Typography is a good example here. So design is content dependent. And we can think about typography. Because the content, the ideas that we are trying to convey, and the way that we convey them should sort of match. Right? There should be some sort of congruity there. Right? You know, a couple weeks ago when we were talking about typography, we talked about, you know, having your font sort of match the tone of your writing or match the tone of your content. Right? It's that sort of thing that we're talking about as we're talking about design being content dependent. And this also extends into other factors of your design. You know, I mean, just think about, you know, if your site content is all about, like, say, dark subject matter, maybe morbid subject matter, right? Like maybe you're a funeral home and you offer funeral services. But then the color palette you've chosen is, you know, bright yellows and light blues and pinks. And you're using fun curly Q fonts, and you know, you got pictures of kids running around a field on your site. Right? This is an instance where, like, clearly design and content is separate. Right? Like, design and content are not required to be, like, design doesn't rely on content. You know, just to exist. But there is a level of dependency there insofar as they should be congruous. They should match. They should be able to bounce back and forth off of one another and kind of make sense with one another in context. So when we're thinking about content in that sort of way, I mean, that's the sort of thing that we're thinking about. And we also see content interacting with design. Right? Because, you know, that was one of the things that we saw last week as we were talking about interactivity. Right? When we include things like rollovers, and we include animations, and we include instructions and links and buttons, which are all technically part of content. But this content is informing the user in terms of next steps, in terms of actions to take, right? They're informing users in terms of affordances, signifiers, and feedback, in terms of what they can do with the site, giving them information about how the design works. Right, so we have this sort of symbiotic relationship here between content and design. We have design being dependent on the tonality of the content. But then we also have the content interacting with the design and making sure that the design works and flows by helping apply affordances, signifiers, and feedback. And this is all within a system where we can completely separate these two elements. Right? And we do it all the time. Right? Because we even do it in class. Right? Oftentimes we don't even worry about content outside of, you know, maybe a picture, a logo for some of our assignments. We just put lorem ipsum in there and fill up some space. So there's some significance there. Now, when we talk about web design being content dependent, we can look at it in terms of the process that we've been working on this entire semester. Right? When I asked you all to, begin work on your final project way back in, the beginning of the class, the first thing that I asked you all to do was to come up with your problem. To come up with your idea for a site, what you wanted to do for a site. And then I asked you to start researching it. So you came up with an idea. You came up with the concepts. And then you started fleshing out these concepts. And then you started designing. So you came up with the design, with the concepts. Then you also started researching to work with some and developing some design ideas that would support these concepts. And then you started creating your site, drawing your wireframes, working on a website. I think a lot of it can be broken down to something that Jeffrey Zeldman, I have his book on my shelf here somewhere, if I can find it. I'm looking on my shelf. I know it's on my shelf somewhere. I have so many books on my shelf. But Jeffrey Zeldman, he basically wrote the book when it comes to web design. He wrote the book, and when it comes to the idea of content and design, Jeffrey Zeldman had this to say. He said, "Content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it is decoration." Which is to say, right, that style, for its own sake, doesn't solve any problems. Which sort of brings up some hidden secrets to some things that we've been discussing this semester. Because while we haven't really been explicitly talking about content, we've really been implicitly talking about content the entire time. Because our focus for our design process has been on function. Function over form. Making sure that people are able to access and do the tasks that we want them to be able to do, to bridge those gulfs between where they are and where we want them to be. And create a design that is dependent on the concepts that come from a problem solving, or that come out of our problem solving research. Or that come from our focused process to solve our initial problem. And there's a lot of strength in this idea. You know, if we examine the idea of content, right, we can look at properly crafted content as a critical element of the user interface. And as such, that should really help us drive design decisions. And so we're kind of drawing back the curtain on things that we've been talking about the entire semester that we haven't explicitly said the entire semester. Because if I tell you up front, the way you develop and craft your content is going to help you drive design decisions, you're going to lose sight of the forest for the trees. Right? This is one of the reasons why we do this. You're going to lose sight of the forest for the trees. Because when we talk about crafting content, we often think about it literally. But we're not really talking about it literally in this sort of sense, right? Like when we think about crafting content, we oftentimes think about it as actually writing the words that are on the page. But it's less about writing the words that are on the page and more about creating the ideas that serve to solve the problems that were identified as part of the process, because the actual words don't matter as much because they can be changed. So we said a couple slides ago, we had this idea that web design is content dependent, right? And then we go into how web design is content dependent. But how does content interact with design? So to understand how content interacts with design, this is where we get back into the idea of contrasting it with print design. Right? When you print something out, it's dead. So when you print something out, you have to have an understanding of every single word you're going to put on a printed piece at the moment that you put it on that printed piece. Because every single word that you put on that page plays a role on that page. It plays a role with the other elements that you put on the page. Right, I have to make sure that I have the right amount of space in one area or another area in order to fit this text correctly. I have to make sure everything's written just so exactly the way that I want it. I have to make sure that I have enough content to fit the right amount of area. I have to make sure I have the right content to fit the right amount of area. Every single word that goes into a printed piece is 100% important in some way to that printed piece. I've done print design before. I know all about it. When you look at a magazine ad, when you look at a newspaper, when you look at a book, somebody scrutinized over how every single one of those words looked on that page, where they were positioned in relation to the images, made sure everything was spelled correctly. Because they knew at the end of the day, they had one shot at it. Because once you send something to print and it runs through the printer and it rolls off the printing presses, it's printed. And if you're printing something at scale, right, if you're printing a lot of something, you can often get it printed for a lot cheaper. Right, I do a lot of mass printing still for people. I have, what they call enterprise accounts or business accounts with some enterprise printers, where I get a wholesale rate, so I get a cheaper rate of printing than they would charge a regular commercial customer. And so then I could sell printing services to other individuals. Do a slight upcharge, still give them a pretty good deal based on what they could get on a regular site. Pretty good business model, right? I know someone who owns a small business, and on occasion they have me order stickers for them to go into their product orders. And they try to order stickers in bulk whenever they order them, just so they have a good enough supply. So they might order 30,000 stickers at a time. And in a standard order, if they're not rushed, I can get 30,000 stickers for about $750. Which in the grand scheme of things, for a sticker that's roughly the size of a business card, that's pretty cheap. Not too bad. $30,000 of them. Like that's a ton of stickers. Literally a ton of, well, not quite literally a ton of stickers. They are very heavy, though. I accidentally had them shipped to me one time instead of having them drop shipped to him. And they were very heavy. But just imagine there was something wrong. I made some error in the design and sent it out to print for one of these orders of 30,000 stickers. Not only is that $750 down the tubes, right? Because but it's also 30,000 worthless stickers that can't be used. So it's a double whammy, right? It's a loss of natural resources and it's a loss of money. Whereas if I have a website, and it's not quite the same because a sticker's a handout, a sticker's a value add. Having some information on a website's a little bit different. But if you think about it in that sort of way, or if we could put information on a website, that website can be changed, it can be updated at any time for free. I make a typo, I make a slight error on a website, I fix it. Company I'm with changes branding. That's what costs money, right? Like imagine when Cleveland Community College, for example, changed their logo. Not that long ago, right? Like last spring of 20, how long's it been? Spring of 2021, spring of 2022, whenever it was. Changing it on the website really easy. Right? We changed the logo file, we changed the colors and the style sheets. Rebranding the website took, 20 minutes. But think about everything that was printed that had the old logo on it, that needed the new logo. The floor mats, the banners, the notepads, all of that stuff. Having to be reprinted. That's big. That's expensive. Now, there are ways that we can change and manage content on a living website. And one of the biggest ones is via a content management system, or CMS. Many of you will take our Introduction to Content Management Systems course in the spring. I think all of you probably will. It's one of the last classes you take before you graduate. These are things like WordPress and Joomla and various other ones that you work with there. They allow you to kind of separate the content from the design, so where you can work on the design and the content separately to where they can still interplay on the website and be integrated on the website, but editing the content becomes a function that resides outside of code. Right, so it becomes more like just editing a Word document, which makes life a lot easier, especially when you have a lot of content on a website to work with. Another thing we can do is just utilize web standards. As we're looking, we can follow the 7 stages of content management. And these are all things that can be done with a content management system. Right? Organization, classification, storage, workflow, editing and versioning, publishing, and removal/archival. Especially if you're dealing with a lot of content, being able to deal with a lot of words, a lot of pictures, a lot of multimedia, it becomes incredibly challenging. So we want something where we can organize our content. We want to be able to classify our content in different ways. Right, for example, content management systems typically allow us to use tags as a means to be able to classify our content as being one thing or another. We want to be able to store our content, have it in a database for long-term storage on our website. We want to have a workflow so we can properly and easily manage our content throughout time, make changes and things of that nature if we need to. We want to be able to edit and version things on the fly. Right? And that's another thing that content management systems give us that makes life a lot easier. Right? Like since it takes and it separates the idea of editing content from code, that's one thing that makes editing incredibly easy. It also gives us different versions. If we look at the back end of a content management system, which is something that you all will get a lot of practice with in the spring, you'll see that it saves a version of the page each time you publish, so that you can do easy reversion if you need to remove any changes that were unwanted. Publishing, so taking it from a draft state to a live state. Again, another thing that content management systems give us. And then finally being able to remove and or archive content for those purposes. And so that's about where I want to stop for today. That's a lot of discussion about the concept of content and design, which takes us to which has taken us in a lot of different directions here. So this is where we'll stop for today. We will turn the music back on for just a few minutes, just in case anybody in chat with us live has any questions. If you're watching the recording and you have any questions, please send me an email or Teams message and let me know. Remember, again, no live class next week. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.